By the time the first hard frost settled over the valley, Caleb Turner understood. Something he hadn't wanted to admit: he didn't really have a home anymore. The small wooden cabin tucked against the Wyoming foothills had never looked like much. 2 cramped rooms, a porch that dipped in the middle, a roof pieced together with shingles that didn't quite match. But it had been his father's. His dad had raised it with his own hands, plank by plank, back when Caleb was still fumbling. With his bootlaces, every wall carried a story. The notch carved into the doorframe where his father had tracked his height each year, the bent nail that once held a faded fishing cap, the scarred kitchen table where they'd eaten beans and cornbread while wind rattled the windows on bitter nights. Then, in early October, the mine collapsed. They told him it was quick. They told him there wasn't anything anyone could have done. The sentences were tidy, professional, polished. None of them changed the truth that Caleb was 16 and suddenly by himself. His mother had disappeared years before, chasing a future that didn't include a remote mountain town or a husband who spent his days underground. She mailed 1 postcard from Arizona. After that, silence. The county placed Caleb with a distant aunt who lived 2 hours away. She already had 3 children squeezed into a house that felt stretched thin. Caleb stayed there 2 weeks, just long enough to hear the murmurs. Behind half-closed doors, he should go into foster care. He barely talks. He just stares out the window, like he's waiting for something. What Caleb was waiting for was a way back. So, when the social worker finally told him he could return to the cabin for a little, while just until winter truly arrived, he didn't hesitate. He packed what little he owned into a worn canvas duffel and rode back along the same dusty road his father used to drive. The cabin looked like an old dog left out in the cold too long. The porch sagged deeper than before. One section of the roof had buckled under an early mix of snow and rain. Inside, the stovepipe leaned at an angle, and thin threads of icy air slipped through cracks in the walls, whistling low and constant. Caleb stood in the doorway, something tightening in his chest. It wasn't only damaged, it was unsafe. The wood stove still burned, but the warmth vanished almost as quickly as it formed. The foundation had shifted enough to leave a slit near the floor where daylight shone through. Repairing it properly would cost more money than Caleb had ever seen at once. That night, he counted what he had: $147. All that remained from his father's final paycheck in the small emergency stash they'd kept hidden inside a coffee can above the sink. Outside, wind moved through the trees with a restless, uneasy sound. A light powdering of snow touched the hills like a warning. Winter was on its way, and out here in Wyoming, winter didn't knock politely. It kicked the door down. The next morning, Mr. Dalton from down the road pulled up in his pickup. He'd known Caleb's father for 20 years. "Son," he said softly, leaning against his truck, "this place won't stand through January. You ought to stay with us, or head into town." Caleb shook his head. "I'll manage." Mr. Dalton watched him carefully, like he wanted to argue, but instead he simply nodded. Before leaving, he set a sack of canned soup on the porch steps. At the general store, the conversations weren't loud, but they carried weight. That boy's trying to make it alone. Winter's going to swallow him whole. Hard-headed, just like his dad. Caleb heard every word and acted like he didn't. Inside, though, everything twisted together: fear, pride, doubt. He didn't want handouts. He didn't want to be shipped off somewhere else. And he didn't want his father's cabin sitting empty while he slept beneath someone else's roof. What he wanted, though he didn't yet know how to make it happen, was to survive right where he stood. That afternoon, he walked farther than usual, tracing the fence line beyond an abandoned cattle field. The old Miller property had been deserted since before Caleb could remember. The farmhouse had collapsed years ago, but the equipment shed still stood tall, wide, weathered grey. Curiosity drew him closer. Inside, the shed was dim and still. The roof held firm. The thick wooden walls shut out most of the wind. Rusted. Tools rested against support beams. A layer of dust lay undisturbed across the floor, and in the center, partly hidden beneath tarps and scattered scrap metal, sat something he hadn't expected. An old yellow school bus. The windows were fractured. The paint had dulled with age, but the metal body looked sturdy. The folding door groaned when he pulled it open. Inside, the seats were gone, leaving behind a narrow aisle running through an empty shell. Caleb stepped in and closed the door. The silence shifted. The wind still howled across the hills outside, but in here it sounded far away, sovereign. He rubbed his hands together and let out a slow breath. The air felt different, still cold, but no longer biting. A strange thought crept into his mind. This space is smaller. Smaller means easier to warm. He sat on the bus floor and imagined it, with blankets, a small stove, maybe a table. Then he looked around the shed itself. 4 thick wall sand, a roof wrapped around the bus like a giant shell. A shell around a shell. The idea was rough, incomplete, almost childish, but it didn't leave. That night, back in the cabin, Caleb lay awake listening to the stove pop and Thewel's creak. He thought about the shed. He thought about the bus. He thought about the way the cold had slowed down when he stepped inside it. Maybe, just maybe, the cabin wasn't the only option. 2 days later, he went back with a broom and a crowbar. It took hours to clear the bus. Broken glass, old insulation, a nest of mice, long abandoned. His hands blistered, his shoulders burned. But when he finished, the space inside was clean and empty. Caleb stood there, breathing hard, his heart pounding with something close to hope. People are going to laugh, he muttered to himself. He could already hear it. A kid living in a school bus. That won't last a week. The thought made his stomach twist. But another thought followed. Laughing doesn't mean wrong. By the time the sun dipped behind the hills, he had dragged in a small iron stove he found behind the shed and set it near the bus door. He hadn't lit it yet. He just sat inside the bus and listened to the wind slide around the shed instead of through him. For the first time since his father died, the world felt manageable. Not safe, but possible. That evening, snow began to fall again, soft at first, then thicker. Caleb stood in the doorway of the shed and looked back toward the broken cabin in the distance. He felt in between memory and survival. I'm not leaving. You, he whispered as if the cabin could hear him. Just borrowing something better for the winter. The cold crept in through his jacket. His breath came out in pale clouds. Somewhere deep inside, fear stirred. But so did something else. Resolve. Winter was coming. People were already doubting him. And the bus inside the shed looked like the kind of idea that online desperation could invent. Caleb closed the shed door and latched it tight. He didn't know yet if it would work, but he knew one thing. He wasn't ready to give up. And that was how the strangest home in the valley began. Not with confidence or certainty, but with a boy who had nowhere else to go and one idea no one else believed in yet. By the time the second snowfall covered the road in a thin white sheet, Caleb Turner had made up his mind. The cabin wasn't going to make it through the winter. He tried to ignore that truth for a few days, but cold kept proving him wrong. No matter how much wood he fed into the stove, the heat slipped out through walls and the crooked foundation like water through a cracked cup. At night, the wind whistled through the gaps and rattled the windows so hard he had to stuff old shirts into the frames just to sleep. He didn't say it out loud, but he knew what the cabin had become. A memory, not a shelter. So, every afternoon after school, he walked back to the abandoned equipment shed and the old yellow bus inside it. The idea that had started as a strange thought wasting into a plan, a risky one, a lonely one, but the only one he had. The first thing he did was measure the inside of the bus using a piece of rope and a carp's pencil he found in Thiesh. Small, he murmured. That's good. Small meant he could warm it. Small meant the stove wouldn't have to fight the entire Wyoming winter alone. He scavenged boards from behind the collapsed farmhouse and used them to block the broken windows. He layered cardboard and old feed sacks between boards, pressing them tight into the metal frame. Every time he sealed another crack, the bus felt less like a piece of junk and more like something alive, something waiting. Inside, he laid down a tarp over the rusted floor and stacked 2 old quilts his aunt had given him in the corner. He dragged in a milk crate to use as a table and hung a lantern from a bent coat hook. The stove took longer. He found it buried under scrap metal near the shed wall, small, iron, and heavy. It took all his strength to slide it across the dirt floor and line it up near the bus door. The stovepipe was bent and short, but he pieced it together from what he could find, guiding it up through a whole-length shed roof that once held a vent. 2 shells, one inside the other. He didn't know the words for it, but instinct told him the wind would have to fight twice to reach him. People noticed. They always did. When smoke first rose from shed chimney, Mr. Dalton drove by slowly, his truck crunching over frozen gravel. He stopped and leaned out the window. "Caleb," he called. "What in the world are you doing?" Caleb hesitated before answering. "Fixing a place to stay," Mr. Dalton frowned. "That old bus. It's inside the shed," Caleb said. "Blocks wind." Mr. Dalton scratched his jaw. "Son, that's not a house. That's a tin box." Caleb shrugged. "It's smaller than the cabin." "That's the problem," the man said gently. "You'll freeze faster, maybe." But Caleb didn't argue. At the general store, the story spread fast. "You hear about that Turner boy living in a school bus now in a shed. Kids lost this mind." Someone laughed. Someone else shook their head. "He'll be begging for help by December." Caleb kept his eyes on the floor when he walked past them. His face burned, but he didn't turn back. He wasn't trying to be clever. He waystrung to be warm. The nights grew longer. The cold grew sharper. On his first night inside the bus, Caleb built a small fire and sat cross-legged on the tarp, watching. The iron stove glowed dull red. The metal walls radiated heat slowly, and the air inside felt different than the cabin had. Less drafty, more steady. Outside, The wind roared against the shed walls. Inside the bus, it sounded far away. He slept in his coat that night, but he didn't wake up shivering. That alone felt like a victory. Not everyone was kind. A group of boys from town drove by one afternoon and stopped near the shed. "Hey, bus." "Boy," one of them shouted. "Got wheels on your house." They laughed and threw a snowball at the door. Caleb didn't answer. He sat inside, tightening wire around a loose board. His jaw clenched. His hands shook, not from the cold, but from something closer to humiliation. He wanted to shout back. He wanted to explain. Instead, he kept working. Inside him, emotions tangled together. Hurt, stubborn, determined, and quietly afraid. What if they were right? What if this was stupid? What if the cold found a way in? The doubt crept in when the sun went down and the world turned blue with frost. But every time it did, he reminded himself of something his father used to say. Big ideas don't look smart at first. They look wrong. One evening, as he carried in a bundle of firewood, he noticed something strange. The wood stacked between the wood bus and the shed wall felt warm. Not hot, just dry. The moisture that usually clung to the logs in winter was gone. They burned cleaner, faster, and brighter in the stove. Caleb stared, Athian, thoughtful. The heat from the bus was drifting into the open space around it, drying the wood. That hadn't been part of the plan, but Clear's throat it felt like a gift. By mid-December, the weather radio began using words. That made people uneasy. Arctic front, unusual, cold, extended duration. Oldman at the store studied the sky and said it reminded them of storms from long ago. Caleb felt the tension to dot at. Night, he lay on his card inside the bus and listened to the wind press against the shed walls like something alive. The bus creaked and popped as the metal contracted. He imagined the cold as a living thing, searching for cracks, but the air inside stayed steady. He fed the stove twice a day, morning and evening, learning its rhythm. Small fires lasted longer. Hot coals stayed alive beneath the ash. His routine became almost peaceful. Wake up, stoke the fire, melt snow for water, read the lantern light, write in the notebook his father once used for work logs. Sometimes he wrote letters he never sent Dad. They think I'm crazy. Dad, I think this might work. Dad, I miss you. A week before Christmas, Mr. Dalton came back. He knocked once and waited. Caleb upon the bus door. Warm air spilled out into the shed. Mr. Dalton blinked. "Well, albeit warmer than Thekabin," Caleb said quietly. The man stepped inside, rubbing his hands together. "You stay in here, full Timino?" "Yeah, you got enough wood for now." Mr. Dalton nodded slowly. "You're a braver than I was at your age." Caleb didn't feel brave. He felt fragile and hopeful at the same time. The radio cracked with another warning 2 days later. The cold wasn't coming. It was already on its way. Caleb stood in Thiche doorway that evening, looking at the dark clouds gathering over the hills. Snow moved sideways in the wind. The bus sat behind him, quiet and still. His strange idea, his last chance people in town were sealing windows, stacking wood, filling propane tanks. They had houses built for families, with thick walls and deep foundations. All he had was a bus inside a shed and a belief no one else shared. He closed the shed door and latched it. Inside, the stove glowed. The bus walls held the heat. Outside, winter gathered itself, and somewhere deep in his chest, Caleb felt the weight of every doubt people had thrown at him, and the stubborn spot that refused to let him walk away. They thought he was playing survival, but the truth was simpler. He was trying to stay alive, and the real test was coming. The storm didn't arrive all at once. It crept in. At first, it was only for sound, a low, uneasy moan rolling down from the hills after sunset, as if the mountains themselves were breathing out. Caleb heard it while he was stacking firewood between the bus and the shed wall. He stopped and listened, his breath fogging in front of him. Something about the wind felt different, not playful, not passing, heavy. By 9 o'clock, the temperature had dropped fast enough that the metal skin of the bus began to tick and pop as it shrank. Caleb lit the stove and sat on his cot, boots still on, listening to the weather radio crackle. Arctic front, sustained winds, dangerous. Wind chill. He turned the volume down. The words were familiar, but tonight they sounded closer. Outside, the world blurred into motion. Snow didn't fall straight down anymore. It slid sideways, scratching gigants, the shed-like handfuls of sand thrown by an unseen hand. The door rattled in its frame. Somewhere in the darkness, a loose sheet of metal flapped like a wounded bird. Caleb checked the stovepipe twice, then a third time. The draft pulled steady, the smoke rising straight into the night. He ran his hand along the bus wall, warm, not hot, not cold, just right. Still, his stomach twisted. He wasn't scared of the dark. He was scared of being wrong. By midnight, the wind had found its voice. It screamed, not in bursts, but in one long, furious note that wrapped around the shed and tried every crack it could find. The outer walls groaned. Snow piled against them, hissing and sliding. Inside the bus, the lanterns swayed gently. Caleb lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, counting breaths. If the shed goes, the bus goes. If the bus goes, I go. He pulled his coat to tighter and listened to the changes in sound, the way his father used to listen for bad weather. So far, the bus held. In town, the storm was tearing at bigger things. Later, people would talk about it, about how chimneys backdrafted and fill kitchens with smoke, about how old windows cracked from the sudden cold, about how propane lines froze and stoves cowed and sputtered. But Caleb didn't know any of that yet. All he knew was the wind in the fire. He fed the stove before bed, laying the logs carefully, then slid the iron door shut. The coals glow like eyes in the dark. Easy, he whispered like the stove could hear him. He drifted into a thin, uneasy sleep. He woke to silence. For a moment, he thought the storm had passed. Then he realized the silence wasn't peace. It was. Wait. Snow pressed against the shed wall so thick that the wind couldn't slip through anymore. The world felt muffled, like it was wrapped in wool. Caleb sat up. The bus was warm. Warm enough that his breath didn't fog. He checked the stove. A deep bed of coal still glowed beneath the ash. Outside the bus, the shed creaked as snow shifted. Against it, Caleb swallowed. If the roof collapsed, the weight would fall on the bus, on him. He pushed Thebus's door open just enough to look out. The shed was dim, lit only by lantern glow. Snow had piled halfway up the walls outside. Drifts pressed against the door seams. The bus sat in the center like a small island. He closed the door again. Better to stay inside. The second night was worse. The wind returned, angry and relentless. The temperature dropped so fast that the radio gave up trying to sound calm. They are dangerous conditions. Avoid travel. Frostbite in minutes. Caleb sat with his back against the bus wall, knees pulled to his chest. His hands felt stiff, even near the stove. Doubt crept in like cold air. What if the metal sweats? What if the stove dies? What if I should have gone to town? He pictured. The warm kitchens and bright windows he used to pass on his way home from school. The smell of soup, the sound of voices. Loneliness pressed harder than the cold. He opened his father's notebook and wrote night 2. Wind sounds like it wants in. Stove still burning, bus still warm. He paused, then added, I hope I did this right. Somewhere near dawn, the storm reached its worst. The wind howled like a train tearing through Thieverly. Snow forced itself under the shed door and piled against the bus tires. The bus shuddered once, then dulled. Caleb stood and braced himself against the wall. The stove glowed red. The air stayed steady. The space between the bus and the shed trapped warmth like a blanket holding it close. He realized something then, not with numbers or science, but with his body. The cold was outside, he was inside, and the difference mattered. On the third day, the world vanished. When Caleb cracked the shed door open, he saw nothing but white. Fence posts were gone. The road was gone. Even the hills had disappeared into the sky. He closed the door quickly and leaned against it, breathing hard. No one was coming. No one even knew if he was okay. For the first time, fear hit him fully. Not the fear of cold, the fear of being forgotten. He sat back inside the bus and stared at the stove. Then he did the only thing he could. Heck up the fire alive. Morning, night, morning again. Small log, steady heat. The bus walls absorbed it and gave it back slowly. The space around them stayed warmer than the storm outside, and the wood stacked there dried further, cracking softly as moisture left it. Caleb began to trust the rhythm. The stove, the bus, the shed. 3 layers between. Him and the wind. In town, people were burning through wood faster than they'd planned. Pipes froze, doors warped. Families crowded into one room and sealed the rest of the house with blankets. But Caleb knew none of that. He only knew that he hadn't woken up shivering. He hadn't smelled smoke. He hadn't heard the stove die. Instead, he found himself doing something strange on the 4th night. He laughed just once, a quiet, breathless sound in the bus. Not because it was funny, but because he realized he was still here. Late that night, the wind eased. Clear's throat knot stopped, just softened. The storm began to loosen its grip. Caleb stood in the doorway of the shed, looking at the frozen world beyond. Snow lay in sculpted waves. The sky cleared into Ahad, glittering blue. The cold was still there, but it felt beaten back. Inside the bus, the air was warm. In Orthard, he pulled off his coat and sat in a sweater. He touched the metal wall and felt the heat stored there. People had said he was crazy, that a bus wasn't a house, that a shed wasn't shelter. But standing there, alive and warm, Caleb felt something new rise up inside him. Not pride, not triumph, something quieter, relief. He didn't know yet what Storm had done to the rest of the valley. He didn't know who had struggled and who had lost things. He only knew what he had done. He had stayed. He had trusted an idea no one else believed in. And somehow it had carried him through the worst cold he had ever known. Outside, the snow stopped falling. Furald held its breath, and for the first time since his father died, Caleb felt like he might actually make it through winter. The storm didn't leave quietly. It backed away like an animal that wasn't finished yet. Slow, watchful, and cold enough to remind everyone it could return. On the morning the wind finally dropped to a low whistle, Caleb pushed open the shed door and squinted into the white world beyond. Snow stood waist-high in places. The fence line had vanished. The road was nothing but a pale ridge cutting through. Drifts. He stepped out carefully, boots crunching, and felt the cold bite his face like needles. Inside the shed, the bus still held warmth. Inside the bus, the stove still glowed. Caleb exhaled and laughed again, softer this time. He had made it through the first test, but winter wasn't done. By noon, the radio crackled with news. The town had taken a hit. Pipes burst in 3 houses near the river. The grocery store lost power for hours when a line iced over. 2 families had moved in Teth Church basement because their furnaces couldn't keep up. At the general store, people stood close together, trading stories like bruises, my chimney ice shut. We burned half our woodpile in 2 days. Had to sleep. In the kitchen, warmest room we had. Caleb listened quietly, his hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee someone had pressed into them. No one asked him how he'd done. They still saw him as the boy in the bus. The joke, the mistake. And Mabe, that was fine. Back at the shed, Caleb noticed something else. The firewood stacked between the bus and theached wall was lighter. Not in weight, but in smell. Dry. When he split a log with his father's old hatchet, the inside cracked clean instead of steaming. The heat from the bus had been doing more than warming him. It had been curing his fuel. He stacked the logs neatly and felt a small, quiet satisfaction settle in his chest. Less wood used, more heat kept. The bus had become more than shelter. It was a system. Days passed. The storm became Emery, but the cold stayed. Night after night, the temperature sank into numbers that made people nervous. Caleb Lernetto listened to the stove the way some people listen to music. He could tell when it needed feeding by the sound off of metal cooling. He learned which pieces of wood burned slow and which burned fast. His routine became steady. Wake before dawn, stoke the fire, melt snow for water, eat canned beans and bread. Read, write, sleep. Loneliness still visited him, but it didn't own him anymore. The bus walls glowed faintly at night, storing the day's heat and releasing it slowly like a promise. In town, the struggle showed on people's faces. Mr. Dalton's truck was parked outside the store one afternoon, hood open. Battery froze, he muttered. Never seen it happen this early. Mrs. Reed from the post office walked in with a scarf pulled tight around her face. My kitchen pipes burst, she said. Flooded the floor. People nodded with tired eyes. They weren't starving. They weren't homeless, but they were uncomfortable, frustrated, and worn down. Winter had found their weak spots. Caleb returned to the shed that evening, and Claire's throat felt a strange mix of guilt and gratitude. His bus was warm enough that he took off his gloves inside. He sat at his crate table and deeped his father's notebook again. Day 9, he wrote. Storm past. Cold, still here. Bus still holding. He hesitated, then added, I think the shed is doing more than I thought. The wind hits it first. The bus only gets wattage lift. The words looked small on the page, but the idea behind them felt large. He wasn't just hiding from winter. He was letting winter hit something else before it reached him. The first visitor came 2 days later. It was Mr. Dalton. His clear throat truck crawled through the snow and stopped outside the shed. He knocked once, then waited. Caleb opened the bus door. Warm air spilled out. Mr. Dalton blinked, surprised. Well, you'll look comfortable. I am, Caleb said. The man stepped inside the shed, then into the bus. He took off his hat and rubbed his hands together. Warmer than my living room, he admitted. Caleb didn't smile. He just stood there, unsure. What'o? Say, Mr. Dalton looked around at the stove, the stacked wood, the quilts. You've been here the whole time? Yes, sir. And you're not burning through wood like crazy? Caleb shook his head. Not really. The man let out a low whistle. Son, I thought you were going to freeze. Caleb shrugged. I thought so, too. They stood in silence for a moment, the stove ticking softly between them. Well, Mr. Dalton said at last, I'll tell folks you're still breathing. Caleb watched him leave, his heart pounding with something close to pride. Word spread slowly. Not like a gossip, like curiosity. People drove by the shed more often. Some slowed down, some stared, a few waved. Clear as throat, Caleb stayed inside, listening to tires crunch past. He didn't want attention, but he felt the shift. The laughter was fading. The doubt was thinning. One evening, as he was splitting wood, a woman from town, Mrs. Reed, walked up the path. I heard you stayed warm, she said. Caleb nodded. Mostly, she peered into the shed, eyes wide. Inside a bus? Yes, ma'am. She shook her head. My pipes burst twice this week. I'm sorry, Caleb said. She looked at him for a long moment. Can I see it? He stepped aside. She walked slowly around the bus, touching the metal with her glove. It's like a thermos, she murmured. Caleb didn't know the word, but he liked the sound of it. That night, he sat by the stove and felt something new settle into him. Not just survival. Understanding. He saw now what the bus and the shed were doing together. The shed took the wind. Thebus kept the heat. The space between them held still air like a blanket. 3 things working as one. People with bigger houses had more space to heat, more walls for cold to leak through. He had one small room inside a big shield. It wasn't fancy, but it was smart. In town, winter kept taking its toll. Families crowded into single rooms. Old furnaces coughed. Wood piles shrank faster than planned. Caleb began to hear things he hadn't before. That kid might be onto something. Bus inside a shed. Who would have thought? Better than burning furniture. He kept his head down, but inside something warmed besides the air. Confidence. Not loud, not boastful, just steady. Late one afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Caleb stood in the shed. Dorawind watched smoke curl from his stovepipe into the pale sky. He thought of the cabin, the one that had failed him. He still missed it, but he didn't feel tied to it the same way. Home wasn't just boards and nails. It was where Theckold couldn't reach him, where he could breathe, where he could sleep without fear. The bus had become that place. Theradio warned of another front moving in. Not as strong as the last, but strong enough. Caleb checked his woodpile and felt ready. He closed the shed door and lit the stove. Outside, the world grew sharp and white again. Inside, the bus glowed softly. And while the town braced itself for more cold, Caleb sat with his back against warm metal and relisted something simple and powerful. What they had laughed at was now the only thing between him and winter, and it was working. The questions didn't come all at once. They arrived the way winter sunlight did, slowly, cautiously, as if afraid to believe what it saw. At first, people only drove past the shed more often. Pickup trucks slowed on Defferson Road. Someone honked once, a short, unsure sound, then kept going. Caleb noticed, but he didn't step outside. He stayed inside the bus, feeding the stove and pretending Thewald beyond the shed didn't exist. He had learned something important during the storm. Warmth was fragile, and the tension could be too. One morning when the sky was the pale blue of polished glass, Mr. Dalton came again. This time didn't knock and leave. He knocked and waited. Caleb opened the bus door, the warm air rolling out into the shed. Mr. Dalton took off his gloves and blew into his hands. "Cold out there," he said. "Yes, sir," Mr. Dalton hesitated. "Mind if I look around again?" Caleb nodded. The man walked slowly around the bus, peering at the stovepipe. The stackered wood, the quilts hung like walls. He crouched and pressed his palm against the metal. "Still warm," he murmured. Caleb shifted his weight, unsure whether to feel proud or defensive. "You've been burning much wood?" Mr. Dalton asked. "Not really," as Caleb said. "Maybe one small pile every few days." Mr. Dalton whistled low. "I went through half Mistack last week." They stood there in silence, the stove ticking between them. Finally, Mr. Dalton said, "Son, how do you think of this?" Caleb shrugged. "I sat in the bus one day. It felt warmer than the cabin, so I left it inside. Theished. That's it. That's it." Mr. Dalton smiled faintly. Sometimes simple beats smart. After that, the question spread. Mrs. Reed came back with her husband. Two men from the grain mill stopped by on their lunch break. One of them brought a thermos of coffee and insisted Caleb take some. They didn't tease. They looked. They listened. "How's the smoke draft? Ever get condensation on the walls? Does the wind get through the shed much?" Caleb answered, as best he could, has showed them the gaps between the bus and the shed wall. He explained how the wood dried there, how the stove only needed some more fires. He didn't use big words. He just told the truth. "It stays warm. That's all I know." The men nodded thoughtful. That night, Caleb lay awake on his cot, staring at the bus ceiling. He felt different. Not invisible anymore. Not just the strange kid with the bus. People were listening now, and that made him uneasy. He thought of his father, who had hated attention and loved quiet solutions, who'd fixed broken things without making speeches. Caleb pulled his blanket higher and whispered into the dark, "I'm just trying to Mackite, Dad." The stove crackled softly in reply. The real shift came a week later. A family down the road, Mr. and Mrs. Hanley, lost their furnace. It died in the night, and by morning the house was so cold that frost coated the inside of the windows. They tried to light the backup heater, but the fuel line had frozen solid. They spent the day huddled in their kitchen, burning scrap wood and cardboard. By evening, Mr. Hanley drove to the shed. He parked and sat there for a long time before getting out. When he finally knocked, his knuckles were red. Caleb opened the bus door. Mr. Hanley didn't smile. He looked tired. "I hear you're staying warm." He said, "Yes, sir. Can you show me how?" Caleb hesitated, then stepped aside. Inside the shed, the man walked around the bus slowly, his boots crunching on ice. "So the shed takes the wind," he said. "And the bus keeps the heat," Caleb answered. Mr. Hanley nodded. "And that space between just air," Mr. Hanley exhaled. "I wish I'd thought of that." Caleb didn't know what to say. He had never heard an adult sound like that. Within days, others started copying pieces of what Caleb had done. Not with buses, with what they had. One man built a small plywood room inside his garage. Another moved an old camper into his barn. A woman turned her storage shed into a tiny, heated core and closed off the rest. People still struggled, but fewer pipes burst, fewer stoves failed. The town learnt to shrink its winter spaces, and Caleb's bus became the quiet center of a new idea. One afternoon, as he carried wood and towed the shed, he heard voices outside. A group of teenagers from school stood near the fence line, the same ones her had thrown snowballs weeks before. They didn't shout this time. They just stood there, uncertain. One of them cleared his throat. "Hey, Caleb." Caleb paused. "Hey, you really living in there?" "Yes," the boy nodded. "My dad says you're kind of smart." Caleb almost laughed. "Instead," Hess said, "it's just warm." They stood in awkward silence. Then the boy said, "Guess we were wrong." Caleb shrugged. "It's okay." And for the first time, it really was. The town began to change how it talked about him. Not loudly, not officially, but in small ways. That Turner kid figured something out. He stayed warm through that mess. Smart boy, that one. Caleb heard the words in passing and felt something strange in his chest. Not pride, not happiness, a steadiness. He wasn't just surviving. He was being seen. Late one evening, Mr. Dalton returned with a bundle of wood in his truck bed. "You're running low," he said. "I'm okay," Caleb replied. "Doesn't matter," the man said. "You kept the town thinking when it needed to." He unloaded the wood without waiting for permission. Caleb watched, unsure what to do with the lump in his throat. "Thank you," he said finally. Mr. Dalton nodded. "Your dad would have liked this." Caleb swallowed hard. That night, he sat by the stove and wrote in the notebook again. "Day clears throat 22, he wrote. "People are asking questions now. They don't lure anymore." He paused, then added, "I didn't mean to teach anyone. I just didn't want to freeze." He closed the notebook and stared at the fire. The bus creaked softly as the metal warmed. Outside, the wind moved through thoroughly again, but not as fierce as before. Winter was still there, but it felt smaller. The next storm warning came over the radio the following morning. Another cold front, another test. Caleb checked his woodpile, his door seals. He felt ready, not fearless, but prepared. As Hesh shut the shed door and lit the stove, he thought about what had changed since the first storm. He was still alone in Thebes. But he wasn't alone in the valley anymore. People had stopped seeing him as a problem to be solved. They were starting to see him as someone who had solved one. And that shift, quiet, slow, and earned, felt almost as warm as the stove at his back. By mid-January, Caleb's bus was no longer just a curiosity. It had become a reference point. People didn't say the kid in the bus anymore. They said the setup Caleb built. That change didn't happen in a single moment. It happened in small, practical ways, like when Mr. Hanley brought a notebook and started writing things down, or when Mrs. Reed asked if the space between the shed and the bush had to be a certain width. "How far apart are your walls?" she asked, peering into the shed. Caleb thought for a second. 6 feet on one side, a little more on the other, she nodded. "So, the air just sits there." "Yeah," he said. "It doesn't move much." She tapped her pencil against the page. "That's probably what's doing it." Caleb didn't feel like an inventor. He felt like a messenger for something the cold had taught him. One afternoon, a man Caleb barely knew pulled into the yard with a battered pickup and a roll of graph paper. "I hear you kept warm through that front," the man said. "Mind if I measure your shed?" Caleb blinked. "Measure just the space?" The man said, "He built pole barns for a living." Caleb stepped aside. The man paced slowly, counting steps, sketching lines. "So," he said, crouching near the bus, "the shed blocks the wind. The bus traps the heat, and the air in between keeps things from equalizing too fast." Caleb shrugged. "That's how it feels." The man smiled faintly, sometimes feeling his physics. Soon, there were copies of Caleb's ideas scattered across Thevely. Not exact copies, adaptations. One family moved a camper into their hay barn and sealed it with plywood walls inside. Another built a small 8x10 room inside their garage and heated only that space. Someone else parked an old delivery van inside a machine shed and lined it with insulation. They all did the same thing in different ways. Make a small, warm core, wrap it in a bigger, cold shell, let the air between do the work. And winter, for the first time in weeks, started losing ground. Caleb watched this happen from the doorway of his shed, hat pulled low over his ears. It felt strange to see grown men using his idea. Stranger still to hear the marg about it. "You want at least 4 feet of gap." "No, 6 is better." "Keep the stove away from the outer wall." Caleb didn't interrupt. He listened. And in listening, he began to understand what he had built more clearly himself. Thiesh took the wind's punch. The bus took the stove's heat. The air in between slowed the fight. 3 parts, 1 system. The town's mood changed with the weather. Not cheerful, but steadier. The grocery store had fewer complaints about frozen pipes. The hardware store sold out of stovepipe instead of space heaters. People stopped burning furniture and started building smarter fires. Caleb noticed something else, too. People didn't look at him with pity anymore. They looked at him with questions. "How long does your fire last? Do the walls sweat? Does it stay warm all night?" And he answered honestly, "About 12 hours if I packed it right. No condensation yet. Sometimes I wake up and it's still warm." Those words carried more weight than he realized. Onivanim, Mr. Dalton, came by with 2 other men. "We want to see it again," he said. Inside the shed, they stood in Alo's circle. the stove humming quietly between them. Mr. Dalton cleared his throat. "We've been talking." Caleb shifted his feet. Talking usually meant trouble. "You didn't just keep yourself warm," Mr. Dalton said. "You showed us something we forgot." "What's that?" Caleb asked. "Their big houses are hard to heat, small ones aren't." Caleb nodded slowly, and the man continued, "That sometimes shelter doesn't mean new, it means smarter." Caleb felt heat rise in his face. Not from the stove. He didn't know how to carry words like that, so he said the only true thing he could. "I just didn't want to freeze." Late that night, Caleb lay awake on his cot, listening to the wind slide along the shed roof. He thought about his father again, about how he had fixed broken things with whatever he had nearby, about how he never waited for permission from weather or money. Caleb whispered into the dark, "You would have liked this." The bus creaked softly, as if answering. 2 days later, a man from the county showed up. Not a social worker, a building inspector. He wore a thick coat and carried a clipboard. "I heard you're staying warm," he said. Caleb stiffened. "Is that a problem?" The man shook his head. "Not unless you want it to be." They walked around the shed together. The inspector tapped the bust wall with his knuckles. "Metal holds heat better than people think." Caleb watched him carefully. "Am I allowed to live here?" The man considered that. "You're not breaking any laws I know of," he said. "But you might be teaching some." Caleb didn't know whether to laugh or worry. That afternoon, the radio reported another front moving in. Not as violent as the first, but close. The town prepared differently. This time, not with panic, with adjustments. People sealed off extra rooms. They stacked wooden side garages. They copied the principle Caleb had stumbled into. Caleb fed his stove and felt ready again. Thekol came and the town held. Not perfectly, not as easily, but better. On the second night of the new storm, Mr. Hanley called from down the road. "Still warm, sir?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "Me too," the man said. "Thanks." Caleb held the radio in his hands for a long moment after the call ended. No one had ever thanked him for surviving before. Word of the bus in the shed reached beyond the valley. A man from a nearby county drove out to see it. "You built this alone?" he asked. "Yes." "With scrap?" "Yes." The man shook his head slowly. "I got people freezing in barns with heaters that don't work." This makes sense. Caleb felt something twist inside him. A strange mix of pride and responsibility. He didn't want to be a hero, but hadn't want people to freeze either. One afternoon, while shoveling snow near the shed, Caleb noticed something new. Thepeth from the road to his door had been packed down by many boots. Not just his, visitors, neighbors, people who used to pass him by. Now they came to learn. The shed that once hid him from the wind had become a place people walked toward. That realization stayed with him all night. Inside the bus, he opened his father's notebook again. Day 34, he wrote. "They are building little rooms inside big ones now." He paused, then added, "It feels strange to be useful." He closed the book and stared at the stove. Outside, snow brushed softly against the shed walls. Inside, the bus held steady, and inside, Caleb, something had changed, too. He no longer felt like a boy waiting to be rescued. He felt like Simeon, who had built something worth keeping. The radio crackled again before dawn. Another update. More cold, more snow. Caleb checked his woodpile and his stovepipe. All clear. As he sat back down, he realized something gempoured. The winter wasn't just testing buildings anymore. It was testing ideas. And one idea, born from a bracken cabin and a forgotten bus, was winning. But Caleb also knew this wasn't the end. Winter still had time left, and the air was one thing he hadn't faced yet. What would happen when people finally admitted he had been right all along? That was a different kind of storm, and it was coming next. By late February, the valley no longer felt like the same place it had been in November. Not because winter had loosened its grip. It hadn't. The snow was still deep, and the wind still cut across the fields like a blade. But the people had changed. How they met it. Instead of fighting the cold with bigger fires and louder heaters, they had learnt to shrink their battles. Small rooms inside big buildings, shelter inside shelter, warmth protected by layers. And it had all started with a 16-year-old boy and a rusted yellow school bus. Caleb Turner stood in the doorway of the shed one morning, watching smoke rise from chimneys. Across the valley, it moved slowly now, not Clear's throat in desperate bursts. He could tell which houses had adapted and which still struggled just by the way the smoke behaved. The cold was still dangerous, but it was no longer winning. The town council invited Caleb to speak at the community center one evening. He almost didn't go. He sat on his cart inside the bus, boots in his hands, staring at the stove. They just want to hear what Mr. Dalton had said. You don't have to make it fancy. Caleb didn't feel like someone who belonged behind a podium. He felt like someone who split wood and listened to wind, but he went. The room was full, not packed, but full enough to make his palms sweat. Old men sat in folding chairs. Mothers stood near the back wall with arms crossed. A few teenagers leaned against the doorframe. Caleb stood at the front, his voice low at first. I didn't plan anything, he said. I just didn't want to freeze. A few people smiled. I noticed the bus was warmer than my cabin, so I left it inside the shed. That's it. Someone raised a hand. How far apart are thralls? 6 feet on one side, 4 on the other. Does the metal sweat? Not so far. How much would you burn? Caleb thought. Less than before. They nodded, took notes, whispered to each other. He wasn't teaching them a trick. He was reminding them of something simple. That winter didn't have to be fought with size. It could be met with design. After the meeting, people stayed to talk. You saved us a lot of wood this year. I wish we'd done it sooner. My boy's building one in the garage. Caleb didn't know how to respond to that. He walked home in silence, the night sharp and clear, the stars bright. Above the hills, inside the shed, the bus waited, still warm, still holding. The final storm of the season came in March. It wasn't the worst, but it was long. 3 days of steady snow and biting cold. In years past, it would have meant panic. This time, it meant preparation. People closed off extra rooms. They moved into their warm cores. They watched their fires and trusted the layers they had built. Caleb sat inside High's bus and listened to the radio. No emergency calls, no warnings about mass outages. No talk of families needing shelter, just weather, just winter. When the snow stopped, the valley stepped out into the light again. Frozen fences, bent tree limbs, but houses still standing, fires still burning. Spring sledgehammer quietly. The first trickle of meltwater ran past the shed. The road reappeared in patches. The hills lost their sharp white edges and softened into grey and brown. One afternoon, Caleb walked back to the cabin for the first time. In Wheats it still leaned. It still leaked, but it didn't scare him anymore. He stood inside and looked around at Theplis, where his father had once lived. "I made it," he whispered. Not just through winter, through doubt, through being laughed at, through being alone. He didn't move back into the cabin. Not yet, but he fixed the roof slowly with help. By the time April arrived, the bus inside the shed had become something else, not just a shelter. A story. People talked about that winter like it had been a teacher. The year we learned to build smaller. The year we stopped wasting heat. The year... A kid showed us how. Caleb didn't correct them. He knew truth was simpler. He had just refused to give up. One afternoon, a man from a nearby county came to see Thebus. "You mind if I take pictures?" he asked. Caleb shook his head. The man snapped photos of the stove, the space between the walls, the way the shed wrapped around the bus. "I've got folks living in barns with space heaters. That barely work," he said. "This could change things." Caleb felt the weight of that. Not pride, responsibility. Hadn't invent something new. He rediscovered something old. Trap the air, block. The wind, he'd only what you need. The kind of wisdom that gets forgotten when fuel is cheap and winters feel distant. Until they're not. That night, Caleb sat inside the bus and opened his father's notebook one last time. "Day 62, he wrote. "The snow is melting. People stayed warm." He paused, then added, "I think this place saved me, and maybe more than just me." Heck closed the book and rested his hand on the stove. The metal was cool now. Winter had finally loosened its grip. Before he left the bus for good, Caleb did something strange. He kept it not as a home, but as a reminder. The shed became a workshop. The bus stayed inside it just as it had all winter. People still stopped by sometimes. Show me how it worked. Explain the space again. How'd you keep it so steady? Caleb would shrug and say, "The cold hits the shed first. The heat stays clears throat inside the bus. The air in between does the rest." Simple words, big lesson. Years later, people would forget the exact temperature of that winter. They would forget the storm dates, and there's no full totals. But they would remember the idea that sometimes the smartest shelter isn't a new house. It's a smelling inside a big one. And they would remember the boy who didn't have anywhere else to go and built something that helped others stay. So here's the question for you. If you were facing the cold with almost nothing, would you trust an idea no one else believed in? Would you stay and build or leave and hope? And what about where you live? What's the coldest winter you've ever experienced? Would something like Caleb's shelter work where you are?